both to those of you, and a very warm welcome both to those of you who are attending here in person in this wonderful facility, and to those of us who hopefully are joining us online. I'm sure they are. My name is Owen Fahy. I'm Head of Responsible Investing at KPI Global Investors, which in a strange work coincidence is located in the same building, so I didn't have far to come. But more importantly, I'm chair at the moment of the CDP network here in Ireland. I'd like to start by, first of all, thanking our hosts, KPMG, who are hosting us today in this, as I said, fantastic facility. I think I can still call it new. I think it's open about a year or so. I'm looking for, there we are, about a year, is it something like that? Opened in the depths of COVID, if I remember correctly. And as you can see, it's a fantastic facility. Thank you very much, Shane, and to all your colleagues for hosting us here today. We'll be hearing more from Shane shortly. Nobody comes to these sessions to listen to introductory remarks, so I'll be very short. I just thought what I would mention, as an institutional investor, a lot of the content today is very practical and it's very much aimed at the corporate sector, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it in terms of the various technicalities and issues and practicalities, more important than technicalities, about Scope 3. But just as an investor, I thought to bring a slightly different perspective, to tell you, you'll hear a lot about the what and the how, and I'm going to talk just for a minute about the why, you know, from an investor perspective. I think us investors that are also part, of course, of CDP, are very, I would say investors regard this as both the holy grail and the unholy mess. It's the holy grail because frankly we have to. I believe there's a problem.
No, there isn't. You're slightly off camera, so
off camera. If you knew my political views, you wouldn't tell. You'd think it was possible for me to move to the right. But it can be done. You can wave at me or shout at me if that's not working. So what I was going to say is that it's the holy. Oh God, let me get this right again. It's the holy grail and the unholy mess. It's the holy grail because we simply have to do this as investors. We have to be able to report on our portfolios the Scope 3 emissions of those, which is no mean feat, but it is essential for a whole myriad of reasons. I'll only just mention two. Number one, under the CFWI regulations, which you either know intimately and wish you'd never heard of, or please, if you haven't, don't, because they're horrible, but they are very, very important for institutional investors, called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. They come into effect properly or fully on the 1st of January. Under those regulations, all institutional investors must, as a matter of law really, report on their Scope 1, their Scope 2 and their Scope 3 emissions for all of their portfolios and at firm level. There's a couple of exceptions, but basically all investors have to do that in Europe now. So that's just one good reason to do it, or second reason why we have to do it. And number two, for those of us like ourselves in KPI that have committed to net zero in much the same way as corporates commit to net zero, under the various protocols around that, we also have to report on the Scope 3 emissions of our portfolios as soon as possible. Again, we have a bit of an out for a year or two, but basically we're going to have to report on our Scope 3 emissions. And naturally enough, if investors need this, then we put pressure on the companies in which we invest to produce it. That's just the way the world works, I guess. So as shareholders, we very much want you. We have to get the Scope 3 data from you so that we can use it in our reports. Not to mention, of course, and much more importantly than the regulatory bit, but not to mention using it in our investment decisions and investment processes, which is the most important of all. At the same time, it's an unholy mess because Scope 3 reporting is, at least now, all over the shop, and you're probably well aware of that. Some companies are reporting it in different ways, using different methodologies, different, if you like, subcomponents of Scope 3. Some of them report on some, not on others. There are a couple of interesting papers, and particularly point to one from MSCI that looked at the anomalies. I'm sure there are many by other suppliers as well, but I have seen one from MSCI that point to the anomalies and oddities if you actually take corporate Scope 3 reporting at face value, as opposed to really digging into it. You can really go down the wrong path very quickly if you take corporate reporting, at least as of a year ago, at face value. But the other important thing to say is, of course, the quality of reporting is increasing rapidly, and events like today are designed to do exactly that. So with that, I'll just make one more remark before handing over to Brian, and that is just to say that, of course, this event is part of Climate Finance Week Ireland, as I'm sure you all know. I'm sure many of you, like myself, are attending virtually or in person many of the events this week. It has become a truly fantastic event. I think 30 different events under the auspices of Climate Finance Week this week. I think something like 100 speakers, and last I heard it was north of 3,000 registered attendees, which is amazing, really. I mean, this event which is now up and running for 5 years, or this week, what do we call it, this week of events is in its 5th year and is going from strength to strength. So I also want to pass on my thanks to Sustainable Finance Ireland, who are the overall organisers of this series of events. With that, I'll hand over to Brian, who's going to make some introductory remarks on Scope 3. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Owen. As chair of the CDP Ireland Network, it's great to have someone as passionate and as clear in terms of the benefits and importance to investors of climate data and climate progress. So thanks very much, Owen. Delighted to have you all here today. We decided at our last meeting that we were missing each other and that we wanted to have an in-person event. It's been a long time. It's nearly 2 years since we last met at the launch of our CDP Ireland report. So thank you again to KPMG for stepping up and hosting this. So for those of you that are online, we will be sharing the slides afterwards. So no need to take copious notes, and we will also be sharing the recording, so you are being recorded. For those of you who are here, we will run on until probably shortly after 12:30, from where we will pop out for some, I'm told, lovely nibbles afterwards and a bit of networking. So thanks to you all for coming. Just to mention again, the CDP results, not the scores, but your CDP responses are up on the platform from yesterday, I think, or the day before. So you can go and read about what best practice is. Scores will be later in December, and we will be publishing our report early in the new year. Just in terms of today, I'm going to give a very brief level set on Scope 3 in terms of what it is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to hand over for the main presentation to Aoife Devaney. There's a little enclave of Irish people over in Berlin running the CDP supply chain program. It's great. I think Aoife is the 3rd member of CDP in the supply chain group, from Dexter right through. So when we talk about leadership and climate, it's great to see pockets of expertise developing in this area, and I think actually you've at KPMG, you've another former CDP supply chain on the team here as well. So delighted to have Aoife here, and she's going to talk to us about the role of CDP in terms of helping companies to gather that gold dust, which is primary data that we're all missing. And then we have a panel, and I'm going to say at this stage very confidently that this is an expert panel, because having discussed issues around Scope 3 and particularly things like supplier engagement with this group, they're all practitioners in this place. So we're not going to talk about policy here today. We're going to talk about practical examples of what companies are doing to engage and to address their Scope 3 emissions. So just briefly in terms of a level set, and this is a little graph that we've developed. I love it because it's clear in terms of the centerpiece being your Scope 1 emissions, Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and what a lot of companies call your operational emissions. We're here today to talk about what's upstream of your organization and what's downstream. And there are 15 categories, and depending on the sector that you're in, as we discuss later, this is anywhere between 60, 70, 80, 90% plus of your emissions. It doesn't mean that your Scope 1 and 2 emissions are not important. They are. They're the ones that you have the most direct control over. And that's your very first basic starting position. But if you're not looking outside of your organization, you're missing the point now. Because every customer, every investor wants to know not just what you're doing, but they want to know what the impact you're having from an emissions perspective. And that's outside of your four walls. That's with your suppliers in terms of purchased goods and capital goods, in your transport, in your travel upstream, and downstream in terms of your investments. So for most organizations here, we have food, we have construction, we have investments. All of these organizations, financial services, by far and away the largest part of their emissions is in their Scope 3. Two little examples, and I really like these just to pick at. Both of them call out their net zero strategy. So Tesco, and rather than talk about this in technical terms, very simply explain it to us in terms of it's the things that they buy that they're going to sell. It's how their customers upstream purchased. It's what their customers use, so the use of the sold products. The running of their stores is 1 and 2. obviously, and then the transport and travel and waste. So nice simple diagram, being very clear that it's net zero total emissions, but that we have an interim target of scope 1 and 2 by 2035. Kudos to Tesco. There's anyone from Tesco here. Microsoft. So Microsoft had their original moonshot. They were going to be carbon positive, climate negative, carbon, the other way around, sorry, you got it right the first time. So in terms of what they've done and publishing, yes, we're saying obviously scope 1 and 2 is very important, but then they give us a breakdown of purchased goods and services, capital goods and percentages. But very clearly, again, scope 3 represents the majority of our emissions, and we're committed to reducing these emissions by more than 50% by 2030. Very aggressive commitment. And then we're going to track and report this against our net zero projects. So again, very clear disclosure of where their scope 3 emissions are, and very clear commitments in terms of medium term and long term. And that's what we want to see in terms of our net zero strategies. That's what the investors want to see from us. They want to see long-term ambition backed by shorter-term targets and very clear, specific data. Last comment, we get asked about the accuracy of scope 3 emissions. I think even the term scope 3 and accuracy in the same sentence is a bit of a misnomer. Really, it's directional journey for us. And it's about trying to, the benefits are in the journey of understanding, and I'm sure the practitioners will talk to us about that. But we find it very useful to look at our scope 3 emissions in 3 different categories. There are scope 3 emissions that we will have control over. It might be stuff like our waste, for instance, or water. Some of the purchased goods that we have. There'll be other scope 3 items that we contribute to, that we have some impact on, but are somewhat external to our ability to impact change in the short term. And then there's a whole category of scope 3 items that people go, actually, how do I even think about this? It's completely outside of my control or influence, but actually I can start to work with partners in terms of changing systems and education. And again, we've got a number of case studies here where a number of the partners, a number of the presenters have actually worked outside of that, in that very indirect supply chain base, where they're actually educating and training and providing awareness and helping. So rather than getting all befuddled about everything that's in scope 3, let's try and compartmentalize it to stuff that we control and stuff that we can impact it. So enough for me. I'm now going to hand over to Aoife, who's going to give us a run through what CDP are doing, how scope 3 fits into net zero, and I guess a little bit about some tips and tricks. So very welcome, Aoife.
Sorry, guys.
Sure, the laser.
Technical issues.
I think is that the laser? No, that's not the laser.
Listen, don't worry. We'll go with that.
Apologies.
All right, no worries. All right, good morning, everyone, and nice to be here. My name is Aoife Devani, and I'm working with CDP Supply Chain Program in Europe. I'm helping suppliers achieve net zero across their supply chains. So I just want to thank very much Clearstream for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak here today at this great event. This morning, I would like to speak to you a bit about the importance of managing your scope 3 emissions in the mission to reach net zero, and how CDP's supply chain program can assist you in this. So firstly, Brian has already gone over a bit of it, so I won't waste too much time on it, but just a brief review on scope 3 emissions. So to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, it's essential for us to be able to label and define where they occur. So to this end, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard calculates a company's greenhouse gases across 3 scopes. So scope 1 refers to direct greenhouse gas emissions from owned or controlled sources. So for example, fuels that you burn in your facilities. Scope 2 refers to indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of purchased energy. So for example, electricity from the grid. So scope 1 and scope 2 emissions then can be considered operational emissions. And then we have scope 3, which refers to basically everything else, all other indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur in your value chain. So this includes both upstream supply chain emissions and downstream use of product emissions. So this iceberg image here can give you an idea of the comparative scale of the impact of scope 3 for most companies. So just to quantify that in some numbers, so from thousands of companies around the world that have submitted data, CDP Supply Chain has determined that the average company's Scope 3 impact is around 11 times higher than the combined Scope 1 and 2 impact. In fact, for the retail, apparel, service and food and beverage industry, more than 90% of emissions are lying in Scope 3. So for none of these companies, they can't credibly have a net zero claim without targeting their supply chain emissions. Here we also have some data on emissions targets collected by CDP. So you can see here on the map, the smaller pink circle has the combination of Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets, and in the bigger red circle, we have all scopes targets. So as you can see from the data we've collected here up in the center left of the slide, data collected from Irish companies in this sample, we're adding up to 2.9 degrees of global warming. And furthermore, cross-European targets are adding up to 2.7 degrees of global warming. I think it's important to reiterate at this point that the IPCC has recommended that in order to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change, we must stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. So it's very clear that corporate sector ambitions across Europe are not enough. So just to sum up briefly on Scope 3, Scope 3 is keeping us hot. And it's the reason that the climate ambition of most companies is very far off track from meeting the Paris Agreement aligned 1.5 degrees. So now I'm going to bring through just over a brief overview over net zero targets and then a little bit more deeply into the Science Based Targets initiative new net zero standard. So to put it very simply, the concept of a corporate net zero target would be to achieve a balance of carbon emissions from sources and removals from carbon sinks. At net zero, we would consider corporate impact to be zero. So in just 2 years, you can see that there's been a massive boom in the number of companies that have been making net zero pledges globally. So from just over 15% globally to 70% of the global economy. However, while corporate net zero targets play definitely a critical role in addressing the climate emergency, the lack of robust benchmarks has resulted in a lot of skepticism regarding science net zero targets and what it means to be net zero in general. So some common criticisms have included that across the scopes of climate impact and the scope of activities, there has been incomplete and selective inclusions of corporate emission sources. In terms of mitigation strategy, many companies have focused too much on offsetting and not enough on actual reduction of emissions. In terms of timelines, many companies have delayed action, so with a lack of intermediate goals for long-term targets. And finally, due to the voluntary nature of these commitments, there has been a lack of scrutiny and accountability. So to counter all of these issues, the Science Based Targets initiative has issued the net zero standard. So I'm just going to give a brief overview. Obviously, it's a very complicated standard, but just try and whiz through this and the new net zero standard. So there are 4 key elements that make this new net zero standard framework. The first element is a net zero commitment to set a near-term science-based target. Many of you may already be familiar with this as the regular science-based target that the Science Based Targets initiative has been validating for the last 5 years. The key difference now is a shorter time frame, so down from 15 years to a maximum of 10 years, and an increased ambition, so down from well below 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. The second element is to set a long-term science-based target. This is new and it helps companies determine how much they need to reduce emissions by to be in line with global net zero scenarios. These targets also need to be aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius and must be achieved by latest 2050. Most companies here will be required to reduce emissions by 90% or more. There are some sectoral differences, and one example of one of these differences is the forest, land and agriculture sector will be required to reduce emissions by approximately 85%. The third element is not a requirement. However, the Science Based Targets initiative does recommend that companies take action outside of their science-based targets to mitigate and offset emissions to support a societal move towards net zero. And the last element of the net zero standard is that companies must neutralize any residual emissions that remain when they achieve their long-term science-based target. So for most companies, the residual emissions will represent around 10%. And companies then will need to balance emissions with permanent carbon removals and storage. So 4 considerations should be taken into account when you are implementing a science-based target at the net zero standard. Firstly, it's important to determine the boundary. So the share of emissions that would be covered by your science-based target. So for near-term targets, companies must include 95% of their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And also, if their scope 3 accounts for more than 40% of total emissions, which obviously, as you've seen, is most of the time, then that target must also cover 67% of their scope 3 emissions. For long-term targets, again, 95% of scope 1 and 2 must be covered. However, with scope 3, the ambition increases to 90% coverage. Next is the target of temperature ambition we need to reach. So for near-term targets, scope 1 and scope 2 targets must reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for scope 3 targets, they must be well below 2 degree aligned. In the long term, all scopes need to be aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius future. In terms of timeline, as I mentioned, now the timeframe has decreased to 10 years. So the timeframe for short-term targets is 5 to 10 years. And for long-term science-based targets, it would be to be achieved by 2050 latest. And finally, as you can see here, there are several methods to calculate and set targets off. But something that might be important to note in the context of this conversation today is that the method of supplier and customer engagement is only a short-term science-based target. And the expectation is that most of the engagement will be done in the short term and that we can focus on emissions reductions into the future. So the approach that the Science-Based Target Initiative is taking with regards to scope 3 is that over time, a company's target boundary would increase. So in the short term, the target needs to cover 67% of emissions, and in the long term, companies need to include 90%. And this is a reflection of the fact that while it is of course essential for companies to cover their whole value chain in the long run to have a credible net zero claim, in the short term, there are obviously challenges associated with that data collection. So this approach is followed to give companies a bit more time to build up their scope 3 approach and to engage with all of the relevant stakeholders. So now we're going to move into a bit more about the CDP supply chain program. So that's the area that I work in, and to talk a little bit more about how that might facilitate you in collecting scope 3 data. So you're probably all aware already, but I'm just going to give a brief walkthrough just in case there's anyone who's not familiar with what we do at CDP. So CDP is an environmental non-profit organization. We run a global environmental data platform for our stakeholders. So as you can see here, that consists of over 680 investors and over 280 major purchasers. And we request data from thousands of companies annually. CDP collected data is used then to make informed decisions, to reward superior performance and to drive action. Companies and suppliers provide data on environmental impacts, risks, and opportunities via our 3 questionnaires, so those being climate change, water security, and forest risk. And the companies that we work with fall across the spectrum. So we have some very advanced companies who have already set science-based targets, and then we have companies that are just starting to understand their carbon footprint. However, the influence of CDP grows every year. So as Brian mentioned, the data just out yesterday, nearly 19,000 reporting companies in 2022, a 233% increase in disclosures since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and now amounting for over 60 trillion worth of disclosed data. So I'm just going to give you a brief walk through the CDP supply chain model and how it operates. So firstly, customers make the request to their suppliers through CDP to disclose primary environmental data. And the CDP supply chain program is helping our supply chain members collect information from their suppliers, identifying and managing environmental risks. So then through our questionnaires, suppliers report data in a standardized way back to CDP and then back through CDP to their suppliers. Thanks then to feedback from both CDP and, their customers. And thanks to feedback from both CDP and their customers, awareness of environmental impacts will increase over time and result in improved performance. So our CDP supply chain members are not asking alone. And in fact, their suppliers may have already received requests from one of our many other members customers, investors, some of which you can see here, who are requesting thousands of suppliers every year. Some familiar faces, of course, are our kind host KPMG, and also our very generous sponsors AIB, who are working for the last number of years engaging their own suppliers through the supply chain program. These customer requests are then combined by CDP, so suppliers only have to respond once. So this really makes it easier for suppliers and customers to exchange environmental data with ease. And in the past 10 years, major purchasers across various industries have joined the supply chain program to engage their own strategic suppliers and collect data through our platform. And we've seen that request to disclose cascade down the supply chain. So as you can see here, based on this example, not just retailers, but also consumer goods producers are now requesting their suppliers in tier 3, tier 4, and so forth. So how then do we use this supplier data to decarbonize industry supply chains? So firstly, supplier data helps you understand your overall supply chain performance compared to your peers and in general. It's also used to assess climate risks and identify hotspots and track the performance of your suppliers over time. Supply chain data helps you to communicate with your stakeholders, like your customers and your investors, on your target performance over time. It also helps you set meaningful scope 3 targets and start conversations with your suppliers on their climate performance and how that impacts on your business practice. With supplier data, you can assess whether there are urgent actions that are needed in your procurement process. So for example, in the onboarding of new suppliers, if there might be more advanced environmental education needed, or even if it might be necessary to end a business relationship with a supplier that refuses to budge on climate issues. And finally, supplier data can provide a fertile ground for innovation and collaboration and to reduce the impact of your business. So we generally see the CDP supply chain program as a tool which moves suppliers from a state of low environmental awareness and environmental risk to active environmental management. So the insights that disclosure generates from participating drives action along the supply chain. In the beginning, working with suppliers, the focus is just on establishing a foundation and just getting them to submit a basic response, just starting to measure their emissions. The next phase is about developing further disclosure capacity. So starting to set targets, starting to report emissions reduction activities, and using renewable energy. And the third and final phase is about improving performance through collaboration opportunities and setting science-based targets. And suppliers who reach this stage would be considered as leaders in stakeholder engagement and environmental best practice. In terms of the supply chain program, your suppliers would vary in terms of where they are on this disclosure journey. Some will be responding for the first time and may need some encouragement, some education, and extra support to get them started on their journey. Others may already have their own science-based targets in place. So finally, I just want to touch on how the supply chain program ties in with overall science-based target strategy. So first, in terms of data collection, it's one point of access for all your supplier emissions data. So that makes your supplier engagement strategy much easier to track. It helps streamline communications about your science-based targets through one single channel to your suppliers. Next, the CDP questionnaire is the gold standard for environmental reporting. So it's designed to help your suppliers develop environmental strategies and to set SBTs. And finally, in terms of your own strategy, it can really help to direct engagement on key suppliers that you want to set a science-based target and help them improve their capacity. It can also give you more accurate and granular data to help you create risk scenarios surrounding individual suppliers' performance. So I just want to summarize briefly on what we've spoken about. Firstly, your impact lies in your supply chain, and understanding where your suppliers are on your climate journey can help you collaborate to reduce that impact at scale. Next, you can't manage what you don't measure. So leveraging primary supplier data can help you track year-on-year progress towards your scope 3 targets and identify hotspots. Supplier engagement is essential to supply chain climate management. So it helps build supplier awareness and capacity around disclosure and emissions reductions. It helps with improving the granularity and quality of your supplier data. It helps you make more data-driven procurement decisions. And it also unlocks opportunities for innovation and decarbonisation within individual supplier relationships. However, I think it's important to remember that supplier engagement is a long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It requires time, it requires resources, and it requires buy-in from all sides of the purchasing relationship. So the sooner you start working with your suppliers to start gathering primary data, the sooner you start that conversation with your suppliers about their climate management, the better. Global warming is accelerating, and our climate action must follow suit if we want to turn around this trend. So that's all I have for the moment. Thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions after this, we can chat, or here's my email also.
Eva's going to be staying with us and joining us on the panel. So Eva, if you want to, we've a few bar stools here. So if you just give us a minute while we organize ourselves a little bit more in the middle here, I'm going to ask the panel to come up, and we're going to huddle around. We've no Guinness, but take her on a bar stool. I'll take one. I'll take one of them there. So. Yeah, perfect. No, you're order. Okay. These are real supply chain guys. So I'm doing process optimization. Very good. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about this issue, scope 3 emissions. So I'm going to start with you, Shane. You're first on my list. You're beside me here. Shane's director at KPMG Sustainable Futures, leading the ESG and Sustainability Service line. Shane is a former chair of CDP Ireland Network as well, so it's great to have Shane here. So I'm going to ask each of you the same question when we get to them. We start off with Shane. As an organisation, obviously you have two sides. You're a service organisation, so you're helping companies as well as, but just to even get KPMG's perspective, how are you engaging with your suppliers at KPMG? How are you measuring? And any of your initial, give us a couple of minutes on your initial perspective on scope 3.
Okay, I'll take you back a couple of years. So I joined KPMG in June of 2020, middle of lockdown, sitting in the corner of my house. When I joined, and prior to joining, I was checking to see what the global firm are doing, what the Irish firm are doing in the whole climate agenda, setting targets and so on. And I could get so far, I could see what the overall ambition was. And not long after I joined, there was a global ambition to set net zero targets to 2050. And then when I got into the firm, got settled, understood what we were doing, just put my hand up and said, well, what are we actually doing here? What's the plan? How do we get here? It was a little bit loose. They had kind of the broad strokes of what they were going to do, but hadn't really kind of grounded it. So line 1, page 1 was, my experience was science-based targets is what you should be doing. It's not exactly clear what you have to do, but you know what the end goal is. So the piece in the middle is to figure out what are the component parts that make up your emissions. So that's what we did in earnest. We 3,500 accountants at my disposal. It's very easy, you would imagine, to get numbers.
Yeah.
And if you had 10,000 accountants, you're still not going to get the numbers, right? So back to basics, looked at purchase goods and services, started looking at what we actually pay for, right? And use that as a basis to say, hey, we can bucket things into catering, we can bucket things into IT services and hardware provision. We're a training firm. We take 450 graduates a year into our firm, right? So training is an enormous part of what we do. It's an enormous bill as well at the same time, right? And then within that bill, there is travel, there is energy, there is equipment, there is people time. And none of this has been quantified with a climate lens before, right? 3,500 accountants, they were definitely looking at it from a cost perspective and seeing how can we shave cost here and there. So that was my avenue to make impact, say, you know what, we can lower emissions and actually increase sort of the cost savings aspect of it as well and make it an operational piece. So people sat up then and went, oh, okay, right, okay, there's an operational piece to it. So that's what we did. We set about getting the numbers right, which is not easy. We looked at where our trajectory was relative to the Science-Based Target Initiative. and figured, okay, we can account for quite a lot of it, and then there's a big leap of faith that's needed, right? And that's the worry piece when you go to senior team to say, it looks great here and solid, and then, by the way, I need you to put your signature here to something that we can't and don't understand quite just yet. But we're going to get there, and this is a rough plan as to how we're going to get there. You know, business travel, we're a firm that have to get out to people. Our clients are everywhere. How do you turn around to a partner-led organization to say, actually, do you know what? We're slashing business travel here, right? And we're slashing. You don't need 6 people going to that conference. 1 is going, or something like that. And they're very emotive topics to be discussing. Catering is the same. This facility here today is expensive to run, and catering is a big part of that. So we have to really drill down to understand how efficient can we make that process. And then, final point in terms of complication is KPMG as an international firm. That's what people think about, but the Irish partnership is an Irish partnership. 99.8% of all our suppliers are Irish based, right? So from IT providers, service providers, caterers, travel people, taxis, everything is within sort of 30, 40 kilometers of Dublin, Belfast, Galway or Cork. So there was a social impact to say, well, if we're reducing costs to try and reduce emissions, there's going to be a pain point for local suppliers who depend on us. So that was the genesis of the discussion. And then the hard work started where we had to start engaging. And we're still very early doors, 2 years on. We have some strong engagement with the, first of all, we did a priority basis piece, or the 80-20 view of it. IT spend, catering, business travel were more than 70% of our emissions. I should say, as a services firm, most of our emissions were upstream, right? So we've that categorized. We were really good in-house sustainability team, not Sustainable Futures that I'm part of, but running the business itself as a service provider internally. And they really started that engagement piece. And that was the key, was to start that engagement piece. A lot of shock and awe at the start. We absolutely didn't go in with a, you must do this or else. It's been a slow process. And the IT guys have been very quick on it. The catering guys have been brilliant because it just brought efficiencies to even their own businesses in-house that we started talking about it. So probably answering too many pieces now. But
yeah,
anyway,
I'm going to come back to that.
That's the snapshot.
That was a brilliant summary. You everything you're going into consulting. Neil, I know you're doing lots of work so in this space with upstream and downstream. So Neil is the Director of Sustainability at Hibernia Real Estate Group, and has been in sustainability for 15 years. So you were 12 when you started or something like that. So a wealth of experience. And anybody who follows Hibernia, you should read Hibernia's sustainability reports, net zero strategy. This man's focus and drive is all over that. So Neil, how are you dealing with your, and you've upstream, I'm interested in both upstream and downstream here because I know you're working on both sides.
So thanks, Brian. High step to fall from there. So yeah, Brian said we're a real estate company, and the way we've looked at climate change, ESG, sustainability has been a bit of a journey. Like you might make it sound like you've jumped in quite quickly, and it's been a couple of years that you've taken a process. But from, I suppose, that we've been in operation since 2013, and right from day one, our investors were very concerned about our governance and how we were, managing the company. That was how they kind of made decisions around how to invest in us, and then that quickly morphed into sustainability and the S and the E pieces. And thankfully, within the real estate kind of sector, there are very good benchmarks which they asked us to respond to. One being the EPRA, best practice in sustainability reporting, and then another one called GRESB, or the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. So without us really knowing this, we were starting to measure our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions before we kind of even call them scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's a funny thing. So we were already capturing the energy for use in our buildings. So it's gas and electricity. So our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we're lucky we managed most of our offices in the city centre. So we had good control of that. We had access to all the invoicing, everything coming through. So we could measure that really easily and very quickly. We didn't really jump into scope 3 emissions until we were asked to respond to the GRESB response, because that asked us to look at our buildings in total, look at all the energy in our buildings. So our tenants, our occupiers, what were they using? So the electricity to power their side of the building was what Res was asking us to look at. So that's still challenging. That's still a difficult process, but that is around 40% of our scope 3 emissions in any year. So again, going back to your slides, scope 3 emissions account for roughly 80 to 90% of our emissions in any given year. The other big chunk then is constructing buildings. So the embodied carbon in the materials that we use to build our buildings is probably another, in any given year, it could be anything between 10% and 50% because it's lumpy. We're not constructing on a consistent basis every year. So take last year, for example, we didn't have much construction. So our capital goods and services, which is category 2 under I think you were explaining earlier, can be very small, and then in 2 years' time we can be constructing 3 or 4 buildings, and suddenly that jumps up, and it's a huge contribution to our emissions. So what we did, I suppose, 2 or 3 years ago, we were asked to respond to CDP for the first time. We were saying what peers were doing across, especially the UK and Europe, in starting to set net zero carbon targets. Our investors were asking more detailed questions around climate change. What were we doing to reach net zero? And we decided, okay, we'll bring in a consultant and start measuring our scope 3 emissions so we can really understand that. And thankfully, within the real estate sector, there's some really good guidance around scope 3 emissions, but also how to measure embodied carbon, how to set kind of not science-based targets, but there are 1.5 degree aligned. UK Green Building Council, various organisations, World Green Building Council have really, really good guidance. So we've been able to mirror that, embed it within the organisation, and be able to tell that story about how we're getting to net zero and how embodied carbon and operational carbon, especially from our tenants, is 80 to 90% of our emissions, and that's where we concentrate all our efforts on. There's, of course, all of the other purchase goods and services, like even using chain and KPMG, there's a footprint there, but that's probably the next day. We're really concentrating on those big pieces right now.
And I want to come back to you after about the engagement piece as to how do you bring suppliers and customers on that journey. Des Ferris, I'm not sure that you were in sustainability 15 years ago, to be honest, right? But as a convert, what you've been doing as technical director in Keelings, obviously Keelings being a very famous, well-known Irish brand, very synonymous with nature and biodiversity and all the rest. But you're really taking the climate thing to heart, and you're driving a lot of strategy. We've gone from the internal piece now to your suppliers. So maybe just share the Keelings journey as well as growing. You're buying a lot of products.
Yeah, well, I suppose to give people a bit of background. People, when you hear the word Keelings, you say Irish business, but we're actually a global business with 11 business units dotted all over the world, with farms in Costa Rica, Brazil, and with operations in Paris and Holland, etc., and the United Kingdom. And we source from about 42 countries around the world. So as well as, you follow the sun when you're in the fresh produce industry. It's now cold and you're coming to the end of the Irish season for berries. So you have to, where else do you go? So you have to follow the sun. Apparently that's come from Holland at this point in time under heated glass. But if I just give you a bit of background in our journey, the business has been measuring the scope 1 and 2 for a period of time, trying to understand the whole journey with regards to ESG and sustainability. And just over 18 months ago, we were sitting down with the family, because 100% Irish owned, family-owned business, and we're talking to the family about their purpose. Why does this business exist? And they came back with 4 words: better food for a better world, because they believe in the nutritional value of fresh produce, and they want to make it accessible for everyone. There should be no child or family member able to consume or get access to it. So we do a lot of work within the community on providing access to fresh produce. But we then went on this journey as a group and said, well, how do we pull it together? Because you think about strategy, of a corporate strategy that talks about, how do you look at all the different business units? How does all that come together? And how do you drive synergies within that? Then you have your individual business unit strategy, which is about finding your unique place in the marketplace that you're operating in, driving superior economic performance and value there. And then underneath that, you just have projects. You get things done, trying to simplify it really, in that context. So we look at the better food, better world purpose and say, okay, let's drive our ESG through that. So we have 5 pillars to drive that. So we have climate, sourcing materials, biodiversity, community health and nutrition, and then our people. And we've been, I say, measuring our scope 1 and 2. We've set our targets. If I take our climate targets, for example, which includes our scope 3 emission, we have a new target of 2030, which is to reduce our operation emissions by 50%. We also have a very aggressive target for 2040 to be net zero. In between all of that, we're setting a science-based target going into next year. And then we've stuff around, our plastic reduction and consumer packaging. We have our forest biodiversity plans in place, et cetera, et cetera. But if I bring you just back to the very beginning, what I've said, we source from 42 countries, and each of those countries has multiple suppliers in them, all with different maturity, all within the different maturity cycles within those countries. So, if I look at somewhere the likes of Egypt versus Spain versus Costa Rica, it's very complex, and we're trying to deal with that complexity. So we had to measure, first of all, understand. So how do you measure from all those countries? How do you get down into the granular level? Do you need to at the very beginning? Well, the answer is you don't need to at the very beginning. What we've done is we've done a study of taking a kilo or a ton of fruit from Costa Rica and understanding what the carbon footprint is to do with that, or a kilo of fruit or a ton of fruit from Egypt or maybe South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. And we use those averages to understand what our scope 3 emissions are at this point in time. And it gives us a number. And I was looking at the slides earlier on, I seen the iceberg. I can tell you the tide's a wee bit higher in our scope 3 emissions than what the iceberg was showing. But it was an interesting journey that we eventually got to the place where we understand our scope 1 and 2. We have a pathway to deal with that over the next 5 years. And now we're trying to find out, well, how do we deal with our scope 3 emissions? It's a very interesting, I suppose, problem to have. So what have we been doing about it, as well as understanding sort of the numbers with it? We decided to survey our suppliers. So we sent them out a survey, a 15-minute survey, to understand where they are in the maturity cycle. And that in itself is sort of gives an indication of where we need to be, sort of who we need to be engaging with. So we know, for example, that our top 20 suppliers are equivalent to about 50% of 70% of our emissions, because we're targeting the top 70% of our volume purchase. And we know after that, there's about 200 suppliers behind that to make up the other 50%. So how do you engage with them? So at the moment, we are working on an engagement strategy that outlines our position through our responsible sourcing policy to our suppliers, saying this is what we're setting ourselves, it's the objectives we're setting for ourselves, and we would like you to get on board with this over the next 3 to 5 years. And that's what we're doing with scope 3 emissions. So it's not simple, but don't overcomplicate it, is what I would say to people. And it's a very interesting journey.
Thanks, Des. And again, I will come back in terms of that approach to data, because I think it's one of those areas that a lot of companies struggle with. Is it's just so big, and we've been asked to reduce it, but we don't fully understand it. And one of the topics that you mentioned, Aoife, so Aoife, welcome. You heard a lot of it, as I said, great presentation. You're also a Trinity graduate like myself, so well done with that. But I was really interested that you worked in the purchasing department of Zalando, was it?
Yeah.
And at that time, we call it the power of the purchase order, power of the PO. There's nothing like purchase order to get suppliers to start moving. Maybe just talk about because I want to come back to the others about the relationship with suppliers and how do you bring suppliers on the journey. What kind of things were you doing, or was there anything in that?
Well, so with relation to some of the sustainability, so I was working in the outdoor sports team, so actually working quite closely with some brands like Patagonia and that, who are obviously really advanced in terms of their sustainability approach. But then working with a lot of smaller companies that working with SMEs on these kind of topics, as you said, like working with those 200 that make up the additional 30%, it's a challenge because it's just resources a lot of the time. So that was something that kind of urged me to kind of go back actually after Zalando and study a bit more into this, seeing that It's so difficult for these suppliers to have access to this information. They don't even know themselves, and they don't have the time. And then the kind of broad range of questions that they're being asked just seems like another task on their plate. So I think in terms of the approach in CDP, we really try to have a targeted approach to work with SMEs to make sure that they have all of the resources and all of the education, and that we take them kind of on a year-on-year journey, so that we have webinars at the start of each disclosure period to help make sure, especially for our members, that all of their KPIs are hit, the most important things that they need to know to track their own targets. However, after that, if the quality maybe of the data wasn't really up to scratch in terms of what the member wanted, we try and revisit at the end of the disclosure cycle and make sure it's a really personalized relationship with these suppliers, that they don't feel like it's just another task that's landed on their plate, but actually that it's a journey of their member, but it's also their journey, and we're going on it together to try and make a carbon neutral world. And yeah, so then at the end of the disclosure period, to try and provide feedback, to provide engagement. If there's someone that hasn't responded, to try and see why they haven't responded, what was missing. Sometimes even, for example, it could be that the supplier didn't feel comfortable to respond in the English language. And then that's another question. How do we facilitate a supplier to be able to respond in their own language? So yeah, it's just really about, like, it's an ongoing journey. It's not a one-year process, and unfortunately, and the data, as we get it in, it becomes more, the more data we get in, the more accurate it becomes, and sometimes, unfortunately, that's for the worse as well, when the picture ends up being a little bit worse than you thought it was. But of course, it's important to have accurate data. So it's all about bringing suppliers on that journey, and I think the supply chain program does that pretty well. Yeah.
Brilliant. We might come back to the last little bit of the supply chain, and we may have a chance for a couple of questions from the audience as well. But Shane, I wanted to ask you about some of the sectoral issues, and we might take a slight deeper dive into some of the sector, because I think most organizations will buy services, and you're a services organization, so traditionally you wouldn't see necessarily services as having massive scope 3. But in terms of your net zero plan, where are suppliers fitting into that?
Yeah, well, relative to heavy engineering and manufacturing, the quantum of our emissions are small relative to cement or lime or steel or construction in general. But they're not. The quantum of it isn't the problem. It's still the same challenges all the way through, because they're not geared to think that way. So in solving the quantum, it actually, you have to really get into the numbers. And I just kind of laughed at to myself when Aoife was talking about the more accurate you get, sometimes the number doubles or halves, and you're like, what how did that just happen, right? And that sort of stuff happens with our own clients and with ourselves. The more accurate you get in data terms, the more power you have to make decisions. So I said at the start, in our own SBTI program, we looked at our spend as the starting point, right? And then some suppliers, when we engaged with them, they had better information than just the spend piece. So I won't say it balanced out. In many instances, it got worse, but that's okay, right? Because we had time to figure this out. But with that higher number in catering, for example, it's a really good example here. Most of our catering was wildly wrong. Spend brought no justification. So we were using Qantas as a general number to get a feel for what that number might be. And then we started engaging with larger suppliers who were thinking about this as well. Numbers way bigger, right? And that's okay, fine. That's our new baseline, and let's work with this. And because there was a dual purpose there, the supplier had an interest in working on their ambition, because they recognize that as a commercial interest for them, that they could now market themselves in a particular way. Their employees will get a bit more engaged on lowering that number. It also gave us a bit more confidence that, okay, the next 10 years we can start to move that needle a bit more, because if it was wrong to start with, it was never going to get there, right? And 5 or 6 years, you just wasted time using the wrong metric. The opposite of it was the IT services piece. particularly how we move laptops around. I think 3,500 people, stuff breaks, has to be moved around. We were using whatever Qantas number it was for IT equipment or something. And it was only a fraction of that in the end, because two companies were using electric small vans, right? They were bundling and reusing packaging equipment. They were just by pure good operating efficiency stuff. They had a much lower number, so the number on the ground was better. So we had the worst catering number and a better IT number, and there were two big chunks of what we were trying to solve. Just if that's a useful example, is to once you lift the lid, be prepared to get a bit of a smack in the chops with the wrong numbers.
Yeah.
Or you can be pleasantly surprised sometimes too,
Yeah.
if you once you start to get that detail.
Yeah, and obviously the lack of good quality sectoral or spend data is an issue.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, Qantas tool is very useful, but it's out of date, obviously, and all of that. And the other point you made is there around, as long as you're using industry average data, you're only ever as good as the industry average. So if you want to demonstrate exactly how you're better than everyone else, you need to be able to start going after that primary data. So very, very interesting. Neil, the construction sector is a little different, and as you said, you guys are, and I'm not quite sure why, who's putting all the pressure on the construction sector, but there's a lot more good data available in terms of scope 3 and embodied emissions in the construction sector. So I'm also interested how you're using that, but then also you're getting into this education both upstream and downstream to try and move the needle as well.
Well, I think tenants, the reason is 40% of global emissions come from the built environment. And that could be anything from infrastructure to the buildings that we build, to materials that go into those buildings, the energy use in those buildings over time. So, but that's a huge, and that's why it gets a lot of kind of effort, I suppose, to answer that question. But yeah, so what are we doing on, if you look at the construction side and the embodied carbon of our buildings, we were using industry standards as well. We're looking at the cost of to build a project over a year and going, okay, well, that should be around X amount of tons of carbon. And that really wasn't the right way to do it, but there was a lack of, I suppose, standards around how you should do this. And if you were to deep dive into that 2 or 3 years ago, the materials that you were procuring to build the buildings didn't have any sort of carbon passports or material data passports to tell you how much carbon was in those materials. That's moved a long way in the last couple of years. So you'll see companies like ourselves doing what's called whole life carbon assessments, and all the consultants we use and the architects are all using these tools to understand the full life cycle of a building. So we carry these out in all our new projects, and we can understand at the design stage what is the projected carbon footprint of that building for right through construction to 50, 60 years into its lifespan. So it forces you to look at the full life cycle of a building, and specifically that embodied carbon piece. It gives you the tools to sit down with your contractors, large contractors, and look at where the savings going to be made. And also makes you kind of re-question yourself, is it the right thing to knock and rebuild a building? Do you need to keep the structure of the building? It questions waste policy, like can you take materials off-site and reuse them? It's very, very difficult with the waste policy we have in Ireland to actually do that, or certifying materials like steel beams, raised floor access. You know, there's a whole industry around providing new materials as opposed to reusing materials, and that's where the kind of circular economy piece comes in. So, you know, by doing these whole life carbon assessments, we're actually having better conversations with our contractors. They're then having better conversations with the material providers, because we're demanding it. Probably 5, 6 years ago, we were being led by the construction industry and the contractors, and they were telling us what's realistic, what's your budget, what's realistic, there you go. Now it's flipped on its head. So we've created a whole development brief that we give to any contractor from day one or any design team and go, these are the targets we want to achieve by 2030. How are you going to help us get there over the next 5, 10 years? Yeah.
And that sort of future mapping where you're going and giving them an opportunity to get on with it. And I know you're training your tenants as well as your suppliers and getting the whole value chain.
Absolutely. So doing such an insight.
We might see, we're running a little time. We were a couple of minutes late starting, so I might steal a few minutes. Des, that piece that Neil mentioned about engaging with suppliers, obviously the costs are going up. Everybody's focused on resources and cost and materials. How do you manage to get suppliers engaged in sustainability when they're concerned about raw material costs or fuel or whatever else and they're struggling to keep the business going?
a good question, Brian. The reality is there's a return on investing in sustainability. You know, so the suppliers currently is buying their electricity from the national grid and they replace that with solar. There will be a return, and over time, they will get the benefit of that return. So I don't think our suppliers are shying away from investing because increased costs will mean they will ultimately invest in reducing their energy costs or their operational costs, and by doing so, there will be a carbon benefit in that. I think the challenge for suppliers and the challenge for us is moving away from averages and getting into the granular. Because I think that the granular, in this particular instance, scope 3 is your friend, and you need systems to be able to do that. Systems that will give you real-time data and will allow you to make decisions with that information. So I'm quite confident our suppliers will engage proactively in that because needs must.
Okay, so if you were advising, and let's just get last feedback from all of the team. If you were advising your suppliers, because many people here are suppliers to large companies, if you're advising a supplier how to address their scope 3 emissions to be able to supply to Keelings, what would you be saying to them?
First of all, measure, understand what you're dealing with. If you're measuring it, you're likely to do something about it. If you report on it, you're likely to do more stuff about it. And then work with us as a partner. You know, we're in this together. We can achieve our goals by helping you and working with you. You won't be able to achieve your goals without working in partnership with your suppliers. So this is a partnership approach. It's not it's not a game for individuals.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really the message I would say.
Yeah, very important. We regularly get asked, surely somebody else has counted that in their scope 3. We're double counting. Scope 3 is a double count. It is an overlap, and that's where that collaboration comes from. Excellent. Need advice to your suppliers or indeed tenants, just to how they prep for the scope 3 issue.
I think it's the same. You have to reiterate what Des said. You've got to start measuring. Thankfully, a lot of our occupiers are measuring now. They're being forced to, whether it's their head offices in New York or San Francisco, they're all being told they want their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And they're kind of coming to me going, well, how do I do that? And instead of me knocking on their door, trying to find that data a couple of years ago, they're now knocking on my door, which is great, but they almost need the education. So we've brought you in to try and educate a lot of our tenants and understand how to measure the carbon footprint. So I think that's one thing we can do, and it helps them then understand that they've got to kind of layer this across their organization with their finance team, the procurement teams to get this data together, because we're all being asked at all angles. It might have been investors originally. Now we've got a few tenants who are CDP responders and asking us to respond to it. So it'll come at all angles, whether you like it or not. It's going to come at all angles. So you need to build the capacity within your teams to understand. And it's not hugely difficult to start a journey, and the greenhouse gas protocol is a great place to start. And just start to measure the quick wins, I think, from day one, and that'll help you with your supply chain immediately. Put you on a good standing.
And Shane, we have to count the accountants. Did you say 3,000 accountants?
3,500.
3,500 accountants. How do we keep them happy? Because you're distracting them with all these sustainability requirements. So they sort of get things done cheaper, better.
Bury them in numbers, right? But what we're trying to do with our suppliers is, first of all, 90% of them are SMEs, right? And they're, like I said, 30-40 kilometers from our offices. And the advice that we're giving line 1, page 1 is play to your strengths, right? You are small, fleet of foot, you can make changes, but so where we're trying to get to as our end goal at net zero. It might mean nothing to you, right? You just got to pay guys on a Friday. It might be your only criteria that you have to worry about. So play to your strengths. So look at how you make your business efficient every damn year you're in existence. And the trick then is record that, to Des' point. Have some metric that you can measure. Don't just go, God, I got a great deal from Nissan. I swapped out that diesel van for an EV van. And they're great, right? Okay, track that, record it. I know you did 80,000 miles in that van over the last number of years. We can do something with that as a metric. So make it real for them and the vast majority of who we're going to be engaging with, whether they're global firms or not, or SMEs down the road, is get that metric piece, make it real, that they understand, and get them to play to their strengths. They've survived COVID, they've survived recession 10, 12, 15 years ago. They kept people in jobs. So they know damn well how to be agile and make those adjustments. That's the piece that we're trying to bring to you.
Yeah. Suppliers are the ones out talking to your competitors probably as well. So they have lots of ideas about how to improve. So engaging with them. I know we've low carbon catering outside. We do low carbon. But any question? Anyone got one or two? Okay, so we have a few, but I'm just going to take two. So the first two hands, lady in the back, and the gentleman in the yellow jumper, just because I saw the yellow jumper.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Keithna. I'm the environmental manager at Midwest Noonan. So one of the things we struggle with is supplier engagement. And as Aoife mentioned, we're in the building capacity phase. So I know we engage with our suppliers in terms of like policies and, have these monthly meetings, but is there a way to quantify or put a number to that? I know the end result is like, it can be measured, like your scope 1, you have a number, scope 2, but this whole supplier engagement and like to put a number on it, not like the end result. Is there like some tips and tricks, or is there anything more we can do apart from policies and, your monthly meetings?
Would you like to talk about how you'd measure the supplier engagement piece, the quality of the supplier engagement? That's what you're asking. And I mean,
Yeah,
you've got third-party tools. You obviously CDP is measuring that. That gives you a score. So there's a bit of a rank and spank there. And there are other third-party tools.
I think, Brian, you could, if you're surveying, do a survey of your suppliers. You send them out a questionnaire, and you do it multiple times over what, 6 months, 12 months. You're going to get a sense of your progress that you're making with their suppliers. And then that should point you in the direction what you should be doing next. I think it's skill set in itself to engage with suppliers in this. It's not easy, and you have to take them on that journey. But you need to get a sense of where they are and what their priorities are in order for that engagement to be meaningful and successful.
I might just add to that. So I think one of the things is it's not just about engagement as a number, but it's also about the quality of that engagement. So in terms of if someone responds and they only just give you barely their emissions accounting, where so you get like 10 people responding with that, or you get 7 people responding with a lot more data, like a lot more KPIs, then that's probably better for you. One thing in general that I would say is really important in terms of engaging suppliers, from my experience working with my members, is having buy-in, especially if you have separate sustainability and procurement teams. Really connect with your procurement team, because I feel like sometimes procurement and sustainability teams can be made into enemies, because, as you said, the battle between profit and sustainability measures. But it's really about making sure that procurement teams have the understanding as to why this is important and how this is going to have this long-term investment is going to benefit the company into the future. Because procurement teams are then the ones that are most closely in touch with your suppliers every day. If they're bought in, if they believe in the approach that you're taking, they will be much better at getting supplier engagement from your suppliers.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
Hi Brian, Philip from FuelCloud. How are you doing? I'm sustainability manager for FuelCloud. My question relates to offsetting, something that you mentioned in your presentation earlier on, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. What are your organizations doing in terms of offsetting, and how much does it factor into your net zero plans, and at what stage in your plan? Because the offsetting market is highly unregulated, and you can get all sorts of claims through offsetting that your company is green, and you can claim that net zero from a marketing perspective, but in the background it's not additional to actually reducing your emissions. So my questions relate to offsetting, and how are you ensuring that you're using credible offsets, and at what stage in your plan are you going to use them?
Thanks, Philip. Sorry, I couldn't recognize you then. Anyone want to comment on the offsetting piece? Yeah. Anyone else? Is anyone actually? Yeah. Okay.
Well, from our net zero carbon pathway, we're looking at reduce as much as possible. Reduce your energy across the board, reduce your embodied carbon, and then offset as a very final solution. That's what you find most people will be doing, because that's the only credible way of doing it. But I take your point. Like, is there enough planets to grow enough trees? No, right now there isn't. So there is going to have to be other solutions to offsetting in the future. And right now, a lot of companies moving away from it. So EasyJet moved away from it a couple of weeks ago, whether that was a financial decision or they just thought offsetting was incredible. I think it was costing 25 million a year or something. So, you know, the people are moving away from offsetting. I'll admit, in our net zero carbon plan, we said offsetting at 2030. When we had done everything we possibly can, we will offset the residual carbon. In the meantime, what we're doing is setting an internal price of carbon. So we're creating a carbon fund. So we're putting a price on carbon from the embodied carbon of our buildings, and we're putting that aside into a fund, which is to reduce the energy usage in buildings, new and old. Okay, so all our older buildings need some sort of capital investment to reduce their energy usage, and that carbon fund then, but it also helps change mindsets and incentivize our development team to look at the least carbon intensive building methods, etc. So, but I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I mean, yeah, I think there is definitely huge questions around offsetting, and we all need to be very careful about how we're discussing it.
So work towards zero and worry about the net afterwards.
Exactly, yeah, it's going to change in 10 years. So, yeah.
Shane, any perspectives on it? You guys are.
Yeah, it's, I mean, in terms of hierarchy, for us, it's the bottom piece. So it's the avoid, we try first, reduce is the next piece, and then the offset bit. It wasn't always that way. We have been using offsets, I think since 2010 or 11, and the quality of them have been, gold standard and so on. That's fine. And it was a good position to start from, because there was a lot of dialogue about why we're doing this in the first place. You should write a check so people pay attention to it. So that's helpful. But it's getting less important now because we have our science-based targets approach. We have principles in place. We have a very supportive executive team. So we have that ability to work in the avoid, the reduce piece. And we still buy the offsets, right, in the interim. But they should, in theory, as we get a bit better at this, reduce. Time will tell. And we're going to have gaps in years where we didn't make leaps that we thought we might make, and so on. So as long as they don't, as long as you're not having press releases about offsets and jumping up and down about them, they have a role to play if you pay attention to them and do the right thing that way. But they should, in theory, leave your process or be the very last piece you do. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated, Brian, with the term net zero, because what we're trying to do is go to zero, actively. And we've looked at the, what role offsets play within our own strategy towards zero emissions. And we've taken the view that actually these things are becoming more expensive as time goes on. And we prefer to invest that money in reducing our emissions and get to the end of that journey somewhere around 2040 and decide if there's anything left to offset. But if you're offsetting, our view is if you're offsetting at the beginning of your process, you have less money to work with to try and reduce them in the first place. So we're about absolute reduction. And that's how we do it.
Excellent. We could, I'm sure, discuss this and many other topics, but unfortunately, I've run over again, but I think it was worth it. I hope you'd agree. We might have a round of applause for our panel. Finally, thank you to the team who organised this, our own Grania and Laura here from KPMG, who did a super job in getting us all here. To you all for coming. Those of you who are up there in the virtual world, sorry for eating into your lunch. And we look forward to seeing you again if you want to engage with the CDP Ireland Network. Our email is at the end of the slide deck, which we'll send out. And we hope to see you at our report launch, which will be likely in the February time frame. So thank you very much, and thanks to the chair and all the speakers.